Hey everybody, George here. Welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to talk about the 7 reasons why fish tanks fail and what you can do about it to prevent it. Let's talk. Hey everybody, George here. Welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be talking about what I think are the 7 top reasons why tanks fail or fish die. These are some very obvious things to those of us who've been in the hobby for a while, but this is really geared towards the person or people that are interested in starting a fish tank and have very little knowledge about what it is required before you add fish to that tank. Now, one of the things that I find is that happens all the time, and this happened to me just the other day. I was in a fish store. I was talking to a guy, and he was asking me about fish compatibility and that sort of thing. And you know that's another thing that we're going to talk about in here. But we just happened to be talking about fish compatibility. So I asked him how big his tank was. Yeah, I've got a 45 gallon here, and I said, well, how long has it been running? How long has it been cycled? Have you cycled your tank? And he looked at me with a blank face, and I said, you haven't cycled your tank? And he said, no, I just basically, when I got the tank, I threw some substrate in there, rock, gravel in this particular case, and bought some decorations, a good filter, a good heater, and I put some fish in there. And I want to put some more fish in there. And it just blew my mind. I really didn't know what to say to him other than the fact that I just basically looked at him and I said, you have to cycle your tank. And he just looked at me with a blank face because in his mind, it was, here's this box, I fill it with water, I put some gravel in it, I put some decorations that I kind of like in there. In this case, he was putting plastic stuff in there. He had no plants whatsoever. He had not cycled the tank at all, and he's ready to put a second round of fish in there, and he hasn't even cycled his tank for the first round of fish. So when I told him all this, he was very, very upset. Not with himself, I don't think. I think he was upset with the fact that I was telling him something that he didn't know. And he could just see the disaster that was coming ahead of him. It's so important to cycle a tank. Tanks cycle at different times depending on different reasons. You want to look at the size of your tank. You want to look at the substrate that you're using. You want to look at how many plants you're putting in your tank. There's all kinds of things that help that tank cycle faster or slower. The more you put of substrate and plants and things that are alive, plants are alive. They're not a dead object in your tank. They are actually alive. And the environment with the heater and the substrate and the plants is enough to get that tank cycled. Now, some people buy these little bottles of bacteria that they put in there. That's fine to do, but they think that's an instant cycle. It is not. It is not. The very most important thing that you can do when you're setting up a fish tank is cycling that tank. And that can take anywhere from 4 to 6 weeks to do it properly. Now, how do we know when the tank is cycled? We do a ton of water changes between the time that you set up the tank and it cycles. I recommend that you do about a 50% water change every single day for the first 2 weeks that you're running that tank. That sounds like a lot of work, especially if you've got a big tank. If you've got a small nano tank like this size here, there's really nothing that's going to take any time whatsoever. You know, you're literally, a 10-15 minute deal every day, and you're in good shape. The bigger the tank, obviously, the more work that you're going to have with water changes and so forth. But the most important thing that you can do is cycle your tank. It's all about patience. One of the biggest things that people get into trouble with in this hobby is that they do not have the patience to cycle a tank. They want instant gratification. They want these tanks to be up and running and looking like this in a matter of days. and it just doesn't happen that way. This tank has been running for a very long time, a year, and it cycled about 4 to 6 weeks before I ever put anything in there. And I started out very small with just some algae eaters and some bottom feeders and stuff like that to get the cycle all the way around and to absolutely make sure that that tank was cycled. Now, the second reason why tanks fail is people don't do enough water changes. And when I mean water changes, I'm talking about I'm not talking about when you're cycling the tank. I'm talking about water changes on a regular basis where you are absolutely taking at least, at a minimum, every single week. I do it every 3 days, but at least a quarter of the water needs to come out of these tanks with distilled water going back in, or water that has been dechlorinated by either sitting out or a combination of conditioners and water that has been sitting out for a while. Now, like I have said in previous videos, I have 7 to 10 water pitchers full of water going all the time for my nano tanks, so that I always am able to do a water change, because there are times in a tank when you can see fish breathing really hard, and you can see that there's some stressful activity going on with that. And the reason for it is that the fish are not in clean water. So you have to test your water to make sure that that ammonia, nitrates are all balanced and doing well, and that you have completed that cycle. But you're doing water changes at least once a week. Like I said, I do them every 3 days. That's just me. You don't have to do that. But the number 2 reason I think that tanks fail is because we have not properly done water changes that are essential to the lifeline for the fish that are living in the tank. Now, the third thing that happens is we overstock the tank. In other words, we put more fish in the tank than the tank is capable of handling, therefore creating another cycle on the tank, ammonia spikes and that sort of thing, because we've got way too much stock in there and we're overfeeding. Look at your tank, look at the size, and think about how much room looks comfortable for you. If you were that fish, how much room would be comfortable for you to live in that tank? Now, this can have a lot to do with how active your fish are. If they're schooling fish, such as cardinal tetras of any kind, rasporas and things like that, they're going to need a little bit more room because they move around a lot. They don't like to be in cramped spaces. But one of the most important things, and the third reason, as I said, is overstocking your tank is just a setup for failure. You are either going to have ammonia spikes or continuous cycles that go on in your tank, that the ammonia gets to the point where the tank is a stressful environment for the fish, and you end up with dead fish. So really be careful with that. Make sure that you are not overstocking your tanks, and that you are being very careful to check on any fish that are in your tank. I do a daily check on all my tanks to make sure that the health of my fish are, for example, I know what's in this tank every single day because I come in here and I check, not just to feed them. If you want to do it when you're feeding them, that's fine. But what I'm saying is at least spend a few minutes looking at your tank, looking at the behavior of your fish, and understanding that that tank is either acting normal or is not acting normal any longer. Now, the fourth reason why people's fish die or their tanks fail is they don't have a proper lid on the top of their tanks. We watch a lot of videos on YouTube and other places, and we see all these open rimless tanks. Rimless tanks are beautiful. I love them. That is not a realistic thing. if you are going to have a rimless tank, you are going to lose fish. Fish are going to jump out of that tank and you're going to lose them. You need some kind of a lid on the top of the tank that fits it well enough to where the fish are not able to just jump and then they end up on the carpet or the floor, and you know, you've got dead fish. By the time you figure out that they've jumped out, now this can happen also while you're cleaning your tank. So be careful to take this. I have a little spot on the corner of this tank that's open for feeding. I cover it. I don't need to cover it, but I do anyway because I don't want to lose fish through there. It can happen. But what I do is I remove this and I lower my water down when I'm doing maintenance on my tank to about where I would do a water change before I do any kind of clipping of plants or cleaning of substrate or anything like that, because the lower the water is, obviously, the harder it is for fish to get out of the tank. If your water's way up the top, the fish can go right to the top of the water. This is their environment. They go right to the top of the tank and they're out. And it happens a lot. And people ask me all the time, why do I keep losing fish on my open top tank? They jump. Fish jump. And it can happen for different reasons. It can happen because they're new to the tank. The tank hasn't cycled correctly. They're trying to get to the top because they're trying to get oxygen or air. They breathe air through their gills, through the water, but if they have no other way of getting it, the only obvious way to go get air is to go to the top and gulp it out of the top of the tank. When that happens, fish go to the top of the tank and they jump out. So it's just a very obvious thing that you need a lid to the top of your tank to make sure that your fish are not jumping out. Now, number 5 on my list of reasons why we lose fish or fish die is incompatibility of species. If you're going to take a large Oscar, for example, and throw 15 or 20 cardinal fish in a 40-gallon tank, what is that Oscar going to do? He's going to eat those. He's going to see that as an opportunity for food. And he is going to go after them and he's going to eat them. So think about, before you are setting up your tank, what kinds of fish. Do a little bit of research. What kinds of fish are compatible? How many fish can go in there with each other where they're not fighting? That's another part of this scenario, is the stress environment. Fish that are being chased all the time are being stressed. And if the water conditions aren't good, on top of that, they're just going to die. They're just going to die. And there's every bit of that is preventable, because if you do a little bit of research on compatibility of fish, some things are really obvious. Large fish in with small fish, it just doesn't make sense to do that. Species tanks, I used to do only species tanks. I do have some community tanks right now, but I used to do species tanks. In other words, if I had a tetra tank, I would only put tetras in there of different varieties. If I had rainbow fish, I would only do rainbow fish of different varieties. I've gotten away from that a little bit as I've learned about the compatibility of fish over the years, and so I have an understanding of it. But you, as a person who's just starting out, wants to make sure that you understand the compatibility of your fish before you go out and buy them, and make sure that you're not setting yourself up for just an all-out war in your tank. And that is just something that is obvious to me, but it might not be obvious to everyone. So make sure that you're thinking about that when you're setting up your tank, the compatibility of your fish. Now, you notice there's a certain pattern in which I'm going here, and that is, we're talking about cycling. We're talking about the importance of the types of substrate and plants and things like that that you use. We're talking about filtration. We're talking about all that. We're talking about fish 4th and 5th in line as to the reasons why tanks fail, because we shouldn't be adding fish to the tank until we absolutely know, like I said, back to number one, that the tank is cycled, and then getting back to what we're talking about right now, researching the kinds of fish that we're going to add to that tank to make sure that these fish are compatible with each other. Now, there's all kinds of different conversations that go on. Oh, I've done this with this fish, and I've done with this fish, and people say they're not compatible, but I've never really had a problem with it. Well, 9 out of 10 times you're going to have a problem with it if it's written in books about experiences with those kind of fish not being compatible with other kinds of fish. Don't do it, because 9 out of 10 times you're not going to have the luck that the one guy has with fish being compatible with each other that are not compatible with each other. It's just not going to happen. So the number 6 thing that I want to talk about is something that we don't really think about a lot, but it's the temperature in the tank. I want to talk about temperature a little bit here because I've had issues with this myself. I believe that a warmer tank is a healthier tank because the warmer the tank is, the less chance you'll have of parasites getting in, and also the fish will actually be a little bit more mobile in a warmer tank because they'll like the environment more. Now, what I consider a warmer tank is anywhere between 78 and 80 degrees in temperature. These are very normal temperatures for fish to thrive in. Most fish will thrive in those conditions. Now, there are obviously certain fish that will not. There are exceptions to that. So you want to make sure that you're reading up on your fish and you understand that temperature is very important to the welfare of your fish as well. Some homes are very warm and they don't even need a heater of any kind, and that's not something I recommend. But if you know your home and you can guarantee that your conditions for your heat in your tank are stable between 78 and 80 degrees without a lot of fluctuation, you're probably going to be okay. But I do recommend putting in a heater if you can, because I think it's just important that the fish have conditions that keep their tank stable and the environment stable in the tank. Now, this brings me back to one more point that I didn't mention earlier, and that is quarantining fish. That actually I'm going to talk about. That's my number 7 on the list here. But it really should be my number 3 on the list as we're putting fish in. But it is number 7, but we're going to talk about that because there wasn't any particular line in which I wanted to talk about these things. It just happens that I was talking about filtration, cycling, conditions of the water, and things like that first, because those are the most obvious things to me when you're starting a tank that you should concentrate on. But quarantining fish, in my opinion, is one of the most important things that you can do. I have quarantine tanks. I have 2 of them set up. They're 10 gallons each, and any fish that I get, I put them in there. I watch them for about 7 to 10 days. I medicate them if they're necessary to medicate them. I do not medicate fish if I don't see any reason to do that. In the quarantine tank, all you need is a basic tank with water, a heater, and a filter of some kind. And if you can put some added air bubbles in there, that's good for the fish too. And keep that quarantine tank clean. You got to do about 50 to 70% water change in a quarantine tank every 2-3 days, because that water is just going to get nasty. There is no biological bacteria that's breaking down anything in there, and that water is going to get absolutely nasty. And you can tell it right off the bat by the behavior of the fish, and you're going to create an environment where the fish are going to get sick. Ick is something that fish have, in underneath their skin all the time, and the only reason it comes out is when the fish are stressed or the environment or conditions that they're living in are not good. So if you're going to have a quarantine tank, make sure that the quarantine tank is cleaned out on a regular basis, that you're not overfeeding in the quarantine tank and those kinds of things. And I would do that like every couple of days just to make sure that the water conditions are optimal for the fish that are being quarantined. Quarantine is so important. You're looking for bacteria, you're looking for ick, you're looking for fish that may have an illness that you're not aware of, what it is maybe, or whatever. This gives you an opportunity to take a quarantine tank and make it a hospital tank if you need to. You can quickly medicate the fish and make it so that the fish have an opportunity to survive. Quarantining, I have very few problems with fish when I quarantine them. If I see something really early on, I'm able to take care of it right away and it doesn't become a huge problem. Now, one of the things that I would say to you is that if you are going to have a quarantine tank, make sure that you're only putting fish in there in a batch at a time. In other words, don't just keep dumping new fish in there, new fish in there, new fish in there, because you're never ever going to figure out whether or not you have a problem or not. By the time you see the first batch of your fish looking like they're still healthy and whatever, they could be developing some kind of a parasite or a problem, and then you put them in your community tank and then you got a mess on your hands. So when you're quarantining fish, quarantine small quantities of the same batch of fish at the same time so that you can keep an eye on them and make sure that all the fish in that batch are healthy. Like I said, 7 to 9 days is what I typically do before I start adding them into my tanks. By that time, generally you have a pretty good idea of the condition of those fish and whether or not they're going to develop any kind of diseases or bacterial problems or just any kind of obvious reasons why the fish is not in good conditions. By 7 to 9 days, excuse me, you're going to know if there's any problems. Those things will show up very quickly. Fish are stressed when they're moved, they're stressed when they get into a new tank, and you've put the ultimate stress on them. So if they're not going to survive and they're going to have problems, you're going to see those problems show up in 7 to 9 days typically. So that's my top 7 reasons why I think fish tanks fail. I hope that you got something out of this. I didn't mean to go on and be really breathy about this, but I thought it was important that we hit on the 7 points that I think are very important. I want to add an 8th one to this one too, and this has nothing to do with me because I don't do this, but some people out there do have fish where they feed feeder fish to their larger fish. The feeder fish that you're bringing into your home are coming from the worst conditions that they can possibly come from. Have you ever seen the environment in which your feeder fish come out of? There might be 500 or 600 goldfish, this size or whatever, that people use as feeder fish. Every single time you're adding a live feeder fish to a tank, you're absolutely taking a chance that you're introducing a bacteria or a viral infection into that tank. People don't think about that. They just don't think about that. It can happen, and it does happen. People are wondering why their fish are dying or why they all of a sudden have, they haven't had any problems. All of a sudden they get a batch of feeder fish that have real problems with ick or something else, and then your whole community tank or your tank with your larger fish in it, all of a sudden your fish are getting sick and people are wondering why. Well, that's why. So you just have to really think about some of the things that you're doing before you do them. That's why, you go back to the number one thing that we talked about, and that is patience. Having patience in this hobby is the number one best friend that you're going to have. If you don't have patience, like I said, you don't really belong in this hobby because this one's not for you. I don't think any hobby doesn't require patience of some kind, but this hobby in particular requires a lot of patience, because if you don't you're going to have a lot of real heartache and disappointment. And one of the biggest reasons why people get out of the hobby is because they have failures up front, with algae blooms and water conditions and things like that, because they went too fast and they just really didn't think about what they were doing. And, they just ended up with problems. Anyways, hit the subscribe, hit the like, comment. Please comment. I love the comments. I like to have them, keep them coming. I like having comments because I like to be able to learn from you. And also, if I'm saying something that's beneficial to you, then that makes me feel good that I've actually been helpful to someone when they're setting up a tank, or if they're having a problem with their tank or whatever. And that gives me an opportunity to really understand and communicate, in all of my videos, some of these important points that are going to help you to be successful in the hobby. So anyways, hit the subscribe button, the like button, the comment button, and hit that bell up there too, because any video that comes out, that's going to notify you. And I really appreciate it. And thanks for talking with me today. George with the Art of Water. We'll talk again soon.